Well, here's a surprise. Bet you didn't expect this. First, let me clear up some shit. As you guys know, I had ended this series of urban legends of video gaming a while back and replaced it with Clearing Confusion, which ran for 30 episodes before I ended it, and its replacement, The Gamer's Encyclopedia, will be starting in the near future. But while Clearing Confusion ended with a note of finality, Urban Legends was more open-ended. I said that if I came across any interesting urban legends of video gaming that deserve my attention, I would cover them. And this has happened. And no, it has nothing to do with fucking Pokemon. I will never do these. Please stop asking me about Lavender Town, Mew 3, or whatever else creepy pasta of the week may be. I will never do videos about them. They're not interesting, and I don't like mixing rumors with urban legends. I had already done one episode talking about rumors, and I really don't like mixing creepy pasta in. As a matter of fact, if I had thought of the subject of this episode back then, I would have done this rather than the stupid fucking Tails doll. Anyway, I want to talk about an unlicensed game today, and no, not one for the NES, but for the Super NES. The NES, despite having a lockout chip, had a lot of unlicensed games for it, as many companies found ways to circumvent the chip. One company that was infamous for releasing games without the licensing from Nintendo was Color Dreams, who later became Wisdom Tree, when they started making religious games. Well, the Super NES had even better ways of preventing unlicensed games, but Wisdom Tree did find a way around it and released the one big unlicensed Super NES game, Super 3D Noah's Ark. First thing to talk about is the title. Yeah, it's Super 3D Noah's Ark, not Super Noah's Ark 3D. Super Noah's Ark 3D would make a whole lot more sense, and that's what it looks like it says on the logo, but since when does Wisdom Tree make sense? Kind of funny, this whole title nonsense repeated itself with Super Mario 3D Land on the 3DS. You'd think Super Mario Land 3D would make a lot more sense, but Nintendo went with Super Mario 3D Land. Well, okay. But before I talk about the game and the urban legend that it spawned, I'd like to talk a little bit about the company that made it. Some people found it amusing that Color Dreams, who made a wide variety of unlicensed games, changed into a company that made only Christian-themed games. Probably the funniest aspect of this is the game Sunday Funday, a Wisdom Tree game released way late in the NES lifespan. It was basically a reskin of a Color Dreams game called Menace Beach. The funny thing is that Menace Beach was a really violent game in which a kid on a skateboard went around killing people, including blowing them to bits with bombs in graphic detail, to rescue his girlfriend from a gang. It's kind of like River City Ransom's story, only without the fun gameplay of that game. Aside from the violence, the cutscenes between each level have the girl yelling at you and demeaning you for not getting there quick enough, and her clothes start coming off, eventually leaving her in just a bra and panties. It was silly and a cheap way to get people to continue to play a game that was both too difficult and had really bad controls. The game wasn't fun, but Color Dreams used sex appeal by having a girl chained to a wall with her clothes slowly falling off. Violence, harsh insults, sex appeal, and bondage themes, and they turned it into a Christian-themed game. Yeah, they changed the story and they took out the sex stuff, but it was still really violent. The story of Color Dreams and Wisdom Tree kind of reminds me of the South Park episode Faith Plus One, in which Cartman decides to start a Christian pop band to make money. He doesn't respect his target audience, and is only in it for the money, and this is basically the case with Wisdom Tree. Color Dreams was having issues with Nintendo, who were getting pretty pissed off about unlicensed games being sold in stores, so they started threatening to refuse to do business with any store that sold these games. So the games were being pushed out of stores by retailers who could not afford to not have Nintendo games. So Color Dreams got the idea to start selling video games to people who would not usually buy them, and work with retailers who did not have a relationship with Nintendo. The solution of this was to change their name to Wisdom Tree, market themselves as a Christian organization, and sell Bible-themed games, which were not sold in video game stores, toy stores, or electronic stores, but in Christian bookstores. They actually made a lot of money off of this. That's the true story of how Wisdom Tree formed, in which in itself it's sort of an urban legend, as the company themselves have given two separate accounts on how they became Wisdom Tree. One was that they just wanted to spread the word of the Bible, and the other was that it all started as a joke. Neither of these stories is true. It wasn't about religion, and it wasn't a joke. It was all about keeping their business alive. Super 3D Noah's Ark was one of their last hurrahs, and their only Super NES game. They instead preferred to make games for the Sega Genesis, as it was easier and cheaper to make unlicensed games for that system. Believe it or not, the company is still around, though they mainly release their old games in newer formats, and their new games are for PC. So okay, here comes the urban legend part about Noah's Ark. If you've seen the game, or even worse, played it, you'll notice that it's remarkably similar to Wolfenstein 3D. So similar, in fact, that you might think it was the same engine. And guess what? It is the same engine. Now this is pretty funny. Once again, the supposedly Christian company using an engine from a violent first-person shooter to make a game about herding goats into Noah's Ark. Yeah. But anyway, the question that came up is, how in the actual fuck did Wisdom Tree get the engine to Wolfenstein 3D in the first place? Well, here's how the legend goes. As you might know, Wolfenstein 3D was primarily a PC game, but it did get a home port for the Super NES. While the port was technologically inferior, the issue with the port goes beyond just having bad graphics, sound, and control. It was also heavily censored. Gone was all the blood, which is especially infuriating as Wolfenstein 3D was not exactly a bloody game to begin with, and all the Nazi symbols, pictures of Hitler, and swastikas were removed, which is really infuriating as the entire point is killing Nazis in a giant castle. The censorship was because of Nintendo. Remember, the early Super NES days were when they were at their most draconian, and it wasn't until Mortal Kombat 2 that they'd ease up on censorship. They even had id Software change the attack dogs to giant rats because they were not comfortable with a game where you shoot dogs. The legend goes that id Software was so pissed off about the neutered version of Wolfenstein 3D that to get their revenge on Nintendo, they gave the engine of the game to Wisdom Tree to make their unlicensed games. Well, it's a rather amusing story, and it's a story that I heard for ages, but it doesn't really hold up to closer scrutiny. First, I can't see why id Software would be so angry with Nintendo. They had to have known already about their censorship policies when they purchased the license to develop games for the Super NES, so it's not like it was sprung on them on the last minute. And Nintendo had no hand in the actual development of the game. It's not like they submitted a faithful port and then Nintendo went in and made changes. They made the game the way it was to conform to the rules that they were already aware of. If they were so against the rules, nothing was forcing them to make the game in the first place. They could have made it for Sega Genesis if the licensee issues upset them so badly. Also, I fail to see how giving an engine to Wisdom Tree is getting revenge on Nintendo, as it was unlikely that Super 3D Noah's Ark was going to cut into sales of any Nintendo games, or really do anything more than mildly irritate them. It's a bit unreasonable to think that id would freely give away one of their engines to a third party to get petty revenge, especially when you consider that to get the game to even work at all, you had to plug an officially licensed game into the top of the cartridge to bypass the lockout mechanism, so anybody who bought the game would have to own at least one real Super NES game. So here's the truth. While it is true that id Software knew that Wisdom Tree had no license to make games for the Super NES and any product they would make would be unlicensed, id Software did not approach Wisdom Tree about it, nor did they give away their engine or source code. In fact, Wisdom Tree did something that was really unusual for them. They actually purchased a license to use the Wolfenstein engine. And considering the fact that Super 3D Noah's Ark sold badly, even for a Wisdom Tree game, mostly due to the fact that they didn't market it, the only ones who made any money off of this was id Software, who sold them the license for an outdated engine that wasn't meant to run on console software for use of creating a game for a console that was destined to run badly, as if you take away all the censorship, the Super NES version of Wolfenstein was still really, really bad. So id Software was hardly doing a favor to Wisdom Tree. They pretty much screwed them over by giving them the poor tools to make a good game. Then again, Wisdom Tree was not known for making good games, so it's likely that even if they had a really great engine that would have run beautifully on the Super NES, they would have cocked it up. One last thing that really blasts the pissed at Nintendo theory out of the water is that according to the book Masters of Doom, both Wolfenstein 3D for the Super NES and Super 3D Noah's Ark were being developed at the same time. Noah's Ark just took longer to come out, most likely due to not being a port, and Wisdom Tree's unfamiliarity with the engine. This means that Wisdom Tree licensed the Wolfenstein engine before the port of Wolfenstein was completed. Super 3D Noah's Ark was the last original console game that Wisdom Tree would release. They'd stick to PC and re-releasing their old games from then on, and it was also the very last game to use the Wolfenstein engine. For those of you who still think that id might have been pissed off at Nintendo, keep in mind that a year after Super 3D Noah's Ark, id released Doom for the Super NES, so how mad could they have possibly been? They continued working with Nintendo afterwards, as Doom and Doom 2 both wound up on the Game Boy Advance, and of course you can't forget Doom 64, which was not even a port, but it was made for Nintendo 64 hardware. So the idea that id harbored a grudge against Nintendo, it makes for an interesting story, but it isn't even close to being true. Well, that's it for this episode. I'm not saying there will never be another episode, and I'm not saying that there definitely will be one. If I come across a good, interesting topic worthy of my attention, it will happen. If not, not. And once again, no, I won't do a video about your Lavender Town nonsense, ever. Keep an eye out for the Gamer's Encyclopedia coming out sometime in the near future.